mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another presentation of IOA's 2009 webinar series. My name is Mike Finnegan. I'm a leadership instructor for the School of Leadership Studies at Kansas State University and will serve as the moderator for this presentation. Today's IOA webinar presentation is sponsored by IOA's Education Member Interest Group. The IOA has 5 member interest communities where members with similar passions connect with one another. To learn more about these communities, log on to our website, ioa.net.org. Today we're excited to have Simon Western. Simon is the Principal Consultant at the Tavistock Consultancy Service, London, England. He'll be presenting on EcoLeadership and leadership formation. Simon writes and teaches on leadership, drawing on personal experiences from an unusually diverse background. He has worked with CEOs and senior leaders, designing and delivering innovative experiential leadership development in all sectors. Now, a couple of observations before we begin. We're going to pause at 3 different points during the presentation to take questions. The first question and answer session will take place after Simon has a chance to highlight the first 3 leadership discourses, the controller, the therapist, and the Messiah. The next question and answer session will happen after Simon talks about eco-leadership. The final Q&A will occur once Simon has discussed leadership formation, developing leadership. Now, to ask a question, simply type it into the question box on your webinar controls. Once submitted, I'll receive the questions, and then I'll pose the questions to Simon during the breaks. Simon is unable to see the audience, but we're going to assume that everybody's smiling and engaged in the presentation, and we hope that you demonstrate your engagement by posing a lot of questions to submit online. This presentation will be rebroadcasted, but for right now, please sit down and enjoy Simon Western as he identifies the 4 discourses that have dominated leadership thinking in the past century: the leader as a controller, therapist, Messiah, and the real reason why we're here today, the emergent discourse of eco-leadership. Simon, off to you.
Thank you, Mike, and hello to you all. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to race through the first 3 discourses to give you some context. And I'm going to begin with the controller discourse. My doctorate research found that over the past century, 3 discourses have emerged that dominate leadership thinking. I use the term discourse to denote an underlying set of normative assumptions. A discourse is considered to be an institutionalized way of thinking, a social boundary defining what can and cannot be said about a specific topic. Discourses are seen to affect our views on all things. In other words, it is not possible to escape discourse. So to begin with the leadership as controller discourse, which began in the early part of the 20th century, this leadership assumption gained credence from the cultural belief in modernism and scientific rationalism. The idea at the turn of the century was that science could save us, and was epitomized in the workplace by Taylorism and the efficiency craze. Fordism and mass production followed. The controller discourse focuses on maximizing efficiency and control to increase output. It was a hugely successful project, creating mass production and leading to increased wealth and consumption. However, workers were replaceable cogs in the wheel of the efficient machine, and this functional outlook was seen as dehumanizing. The controller leadership discourse became less popular and was surpassed by the therapist discourse in the post-war period. The war had revealed that science could be both a saving force but also a destructive one. 2 things stood out. The Holocaust mimicked the efficiency of the factory using bureaucracy and instrumentalism to kill millions. And secondly, the atomic bomb showed that science could destroy the world. Post-Second World War demanded a different discourse of leadership, particularly a more humane one. However, the controller discourse still remains. It particularly follows manufacturing industries. Recent attempts to modernize the public sector have seen a reversion to controller leadership, focusing on targets, audit control to achieve greater outputs. In the leader as controller discourse, the leader's task is to control the worker's body. I'll now move on to the therapist discourse. In the post-war culture, the idea was to focus on democratizing the workplace to create a world fit for heroes. In the therapist discourse, a leader's task is to motivate individuals and teams, the idea being that a happy worker is a more productive worker. Influenced by the human relations movement, Elton Mayo, Maslow, Kurt Lewin and Carl Rogers and the Tavistock Institute, and then further influenced by the 1960s, the ideas of personal growth and the rise of individualism became the dominant force in society, and therapeutic culture entered the workplace. Leaders were encouraged to self-actualize so that people came to work on themselves. The therapist discourse embraces therapeutic culture and focuses on engaging workers in order to increase motivation and commitment. Personnel departments were established to achieve this. The leader's therapist discourse remains very popular in education and public and voluntary sector and other people-focused organisations. Leadership development is also dominated by the therapist discourse, often focusing on developing the self using psychometrics and coaching to attempt to offer personal insight and modify behaviour. In the leader's therapist discourse, the leader's influence comes from working with employees' minds. And to move quickly on to the leader's Messiah Discourse. The leader Messiah Discourse rose in the late 1970s, and this followed an economic slump in the USA and the West. Production fell and the Asian tiger economies rose, outcompeting the West in many areas. The leader's therapist discourse was not delivering, and a new covenantal leadership emerged. The aim was to create strong and dynamic cultures under the vision of a transformational leader. Loyalty and commitment within teams, linking personal success to company success was a key goal. Barley and Kunder in 1992 point to 3 tenets of this new cultural leadership. The company as community, the company being the main site for employees to experience community, would mean that ultimately the company would become a fully fledged communitas, bringing pride and a feeling of belonging to the employees. Strong cultures would be consciously designed and manipulated, so cultures would become engineered, and the value of conformity and emotional commitment would foster financial gain. Peters and Waterman, in Search of Excellence, talked about fanatic centralists around core values, and cult-like cultures being the most successful organisations. Burns and Bass work on transformational leadership, talked of moral leaders with missionary zeal forging new cultures. The Messiah Discourse draws on Asian collectivist cultures, Uchi's theory is dead. However, my book links the Messiah Discourse to the rise of Christian fundamentalism in the USA. They both arose at the same time, and I claim that corporate leadership mimicked the unusual new organisational forms that these church communities threw up. Successful transformational church leaders, prophetic leaders, managed to create entrepreneurial and dynamic and yet highly conformist cultures, similar to what was desired in corporations. However, the Messiah Discourse often leads to totalizing conformist cultures, creating homogeneous cultures that resist critical reflection and exclude diversity. Within these cultures, control is achieved via peer and self-surveillance, rather than hierarchical power coercion. In the Messiah Discourse, the leader's task is to influence the worker's soul. People work because they buy into the vision. I'm going to stop there and take some questions, Mike.
All right, sounds good, Simon. The first question that we had, when explaining the 3 discourses such as the controller, therapist, and Messiah, Simon, in your opinion, who do you feel are iconic leaders that represent these 3 discourses so we can kind of put a name with the idea?
There's many different, these are discourses which underlie people's kind of assumptions, and I tend not to kind of name individual leaders, because the whole discourse of leadership gets wrapped up around heroic leadership and individuals. And my work is to try and work away from that model. So I try not to kind of name individuals as kind of examples, because these discourses go right through kind of cultures, and followers take on kind of these organizations. But you can certainly see how these enact. So the controller discourse is very much enacted. Leaders enact this very much in manufacturing industries. You see them in certain industries. You see them in certain parts of companies.
Sure, sure. And I think from a broad perspective, we can all kind of identify leaders that we see fit into those specific relationships. Fantastic. Simon, second question. From a cultural perspective, do you see certain discourses as specific parts of the world today?
Parts of the world. These discourses are come out of the West, basically, but you can certainly see that the therapist discourse is very much kind of a Western model of leadership. Is still very, very strong. The Messiah and control leadership you can see in different parts of the developing world, but you also see it in different sectors as well. So these things come up in different sectors, in different parts of the world, and within different organizations. You might see the controller discourse within a financial department and the Messiah discourse in the boardroom. So they cross over even within sectors and within organizations themselves.
Gotcha. Next question that came from one of our panelists. What are the negative impacts of the Messiah discourse?
Okay, the negative impacts of the Messiah discourse are really that they become like, they turn organizations initially into highly dynamic, emotionally charged organizations where people are working really hard, all following aligned cultures, but they end up becoming cultures which are fundamentalist mindsets. So unless you buy into the company vision, you're excluded, and this excludes diversity, excludes creativity, and you get things like Enron turning up where people don't question the ethics, they don't question the norms, everyone's playing on under a kind of a specific culture. So the danger are they become quite fundamentalist in their mindsets.
Okay, and Simon, one more question, then we'll move on to the next part of the presentation. Is society moving back to the idea of a Messiah discourse, especially with the slumping economy?
Well, it's interesting. I can only speak from I've worked in the States a bit, and I work in Europe quite a lot. The controller discourse is re-emerging within audit culture and target culture and goal culture. I mean, it's becoming very powerful again. We're yet to see what's going to happen with the Messiah discourse. It might arise again. Obama obviously signified partly a Messiah discourse in the States, but he also had aspects of the eco-leadership, which I'm going to talk about later.
Fantastic. And with that, Simon, let's move along with the presentation.
Okay, we'll go on. So I'll just give you a minute to read this slide. So the eco-leadership discourse. The economy began to slide in the late part of the 21st century, early part of the 21st century, and it crashed, as we know, in 2008. Firms with Messiah leaders had initial success, but the veneer of messianic leadership didn't last. Enron and other collapses showed the vulnerability of homogeneous, totalized workforces, whose workers were dynamic, yet became very conformist. Whole sectors lacked systemic thinking and critical reflection and blurred ethics, which led to the financial collapse. The eco-leadership discourse emerged around 2000. Prior to this, the eco-leadership discourse was a marginal discourse in the realms of activists, environmentalists, and a few progressive leaders interested in systems theory, complexity, and sustainability. However, it became mainstream due to the failure of the Messiah leadership and the realization that the world was fast changing. Key meta-factors signified interdependence and connectedness. For example, quantum physics. There was a realization of finite resources, finite natural resources, and climate change. It suddenly became very real. And then the technological advances and increased globalization made the world a smaller world and a very connected world. A new paradigm in leadership was needed, and eco-leadership is now the emergent discourse yet to be fully realized. The eco-leader faces both ways, internally and externally. This is not just about the environment or sustainability. The eco-leader thinks about the organization as an ecosystem. And within that, the leader creates thinking spaces, tries to break up silo culture, always working to connect and communicate, working with feedback loops to respond to change, and creating an organizational architecture that enables distributed leadership with the aim of creating an adaptive organization. Eco-leadership is not just about the environment, but focus on connectivity, interdependence, ethics, and leadership spirit. Corporations could no longer ignore consumer power. Speed of communications meant that leading an organization simply for profit and ignoring issues such as child labor in India, environmental dumping of toxic waste can quickly destroy a whole brand. They could no longer centrally govern the complexity of the multinational and transnational company. Central control was over. Eco-leaders aim to decentralize and to distribute leadership, encouraging leadership from the edge and building networks that are responsive and adaptive to change. It is a recognition that the leadership and central control is obsolete in a globalized world. Eco-leadership works to sustain an ecosystem that includes stakeholders and competitors, building coalitions, networks, and collaborative relationships. Eco-leaders recognize the need to address in the present the issues of finite resources, climate change, and social responsibility. Progressive business and political leaders are finally embracing this discourse. New business models are part of eco-leadership thinking. If you think about Apple Mac computers, early mistakes, they lost out to Microsoft because of their business model. But the new iPhone is a good example of eco-leadership. The apps are good examples where you just don't sell products, but you build networks, where innovation comes from outside of the company, not just internally. It's quite simple. You cannot simply innovate everything from within. You create collaborative business model which allows innovation from without, and you build networks with stakeholders to build on success. So it's a whole way of thinking about networks. We think about an ecosystem with boundaries, so the eco-leader is thinking about their organization as an ecosystem within an ecosystem. They pay attention to the external environment, to the politics, to environmental trends. They ensure that their organization responds to opportunities and challenges within the wider external environment. Companies which just keep their heads down and focus on profit, not looking at technological changes, not looking at developments in the wider ecosystem, are flawed. So the whole project of eco-leadership really is a shift, a paradigm shift, from thinking about the organization as a closed system to thinking about it as an open system and an ecosystem. The leader specifically focuses on creating spaces rather than changing behaviors or creating new hierarchies. The spaces are there for creativity to emerge. They create, they use technology, they use networks. They think about the boundaries of the organization as being very porous. So the organization can grow and contract quickly, and it can allow communication across the boundaries of the organization into the wider ecosystem. I'm gonna just take a break, Mike, and see if anyone wants to ask questions about the eco-leader at this stage.
Sure, you got it, and our audience has definitely responded with a lot of questions. At this time, please do submit questions. Simon, the first question that we have for you, who are some of the authors and works who contribute to the discourse of eco-leadership?
The authors who are the system thinkers from Bateson right through to Senge, Fritz Capri. A lot of the work from eco-leadership does emerge from the biological open systems theorists and it comes from the environmental thinkers and is drifted in. These discourses, they drift in from the social and from the economic from the outside. So what happens outside organizations drifts in. So the humanist movement in the 50s drifted into the workplace as therapeutic culture, and the environmental movement now is drifted into the eco-leadership discourse. So it's people who are writing on systems, on complexity, and the environmental kind of biologists. But Gregory Bateson was the father of this kind of the work, really.
Sounds good. Simon, this next question is a two-part question. How might eco-leadership impact leadership and organizational development? Part 2, will organizations be willing to fund the development required to adopt this model?
So repeat part 1 for me, Mike.
Yep. Part 1, how might eco-leadership impact leadership and organizational development? So what's the impact that organizations are going to see by embracing eco-leadership, and then are they going to be able to come up with the funds to adopt this model in their companies and organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's about funds. The model really is about, what I say about eco-leadership is that it's an emergent discourse, so that really we don't know how to do it yet. It's very new, and it's around, and people are trying to get their minds around and their organizations around how to do this thing. They know how to do it. They know they need to do it. They know they have to pay attention to the environment. They know have to think about sustainability. They know have to think about their organization's kind of future resources. They know they have to kind of develop all these new connections, but they don't know how to do it yet. So the organizations are trying to do this by creating distributed leadership. They're trying to, and it's not so much about money, it's more about kind of having the vision and kind of allowing power to drift from the center towards the edges. So this is very much about leading from the edges, getting closer to the customers, and it's really a power shift. It's really a different way of thinking where you disseminate power throughout the organization. And each organization, what I say about eco-leadership is that each organization is a very specific ecosystem. So we're not talking about generalizing kind of ways of doing eco-leadership. We're asking each organization to really think about kind of what their ecosystem is, what their business is, what their product is, what they're working on, and then how do they disseminate power, how do they kind of lead from the edges, how do they get close to their customers, and how do they build these feedback loops.
Gotcha. And Simon, a follow-up question to that, which I think fits really well, you talked about companies kind of defining it for themselves, but is there a foundation or certain competencies that an eco-leader needs to embody?
Yeah, rather than competences, it's a way of thinking, and it's really a holistic way of thinking. It's systems thinking. It's really trying to make some sense of your organization as an adaptive organization, thinking of it in terms of an organic organization, really, which is going to grow and going to respond to the environment around it. So the competences are really kind of are having a much broader sense of leadership than in the past, where you'd really focus on kind of profit and focus on control and focus on running the organization. It's really thinking in a systemic way. So the competences are systemic thinking, really, decentralizing, being able to kind of not be a power freak or controller, being able to let go of power, being able to kind of work collaboratively, particularly partnerships are kind of really important to this way of thinking.
Gotcha. Simon, another question. What are the implications of adopting eco-leadership at the board and strategic leadership levels of an organization?
The implications are that the board have to find a way to distribute their power and their authority. They have to think about who's sat around the table as well. I talk about eco-leadership as being about connectivity, being about leadership spirit, and being about ethics. So they should first be looking at the board, and if it's all white men, they've got a problem. So they need to kind of think about who's at the board, what voices are being listened to, what voices need to be listened to, their engagement with the rest of the organization, their connectivity to the edges of the organization, to their customers. So they really have to start thinking about ways of hearing the variety of voices within their organization and beyond, within their stakeholders, and how they can start distributing kind of power, and how they can start connecting and getting communications. So their job is, rather than kind of controlling the organization and responding to only to short-term shareholder value, they really have to kind of think in a much more sustainable way. They have to think about how they connect to their organization. And one of the key factors for these for the boards are communication. How are they going to kind of because their leadership is much more symbolic than that through control and power. So how do they symbolically send the messages to kind of distribute leadership and engage people throughout the organization, and get their stakeholders to think more sustainably and more strategically for the future?
And Simon, this next question, I really like it because I think it kind of ties in maybe a specific example that you could address that supports what you've just said. Here's the question, and let me know if you can address this or not. There's a trend that began in the UK called transition towns, in which the traditional leadership of a town or community, the elected officials, are followers of the process and supportive of it, but they're not initiators. Can you address this trend?
Yeah, I mean, it's an exciting trend, and I think that corporations and organizations, big public sector organizations, have to learn from these trends. Transition towns are a good example of setting out that they work in a very distributed way. They encourage kind of ideas to grow. They work in clusters. People have anyone can have an idea. They can you'll set up a kind of a group in a town, and you'll think about how you're going to change your town to be kind of environmentally much cleaner. How you're going to kind of develop your own energy sources, and people within that group will just go off and form ideas and form subgroups. In my own town here at Lancaster in the UK, there's a transition town, and it's incredibly effective, and it's exactly what organizations are trying to mimic, really. How do you get that energy? How do you get people kind of to be creative, to be take up leadership themselves, and not just act as being led and followers? So it's a very exciting kind of innovation, and that's what kind of organizations are trying to learn in the public and the private sectors.
Good. Simon, you talked a lot about eco-leadership on your slides, and then we just had 4 or 5 questions come up that pertain to the topic. Before we move on in the presentation, is there a short summary that you'd like to let the audience hear on to make sure that we really get what you're saying? Sure.
The summary is that really at the heart of the discourse is you put ethics at the heart, you put connectivity at the heart. It's really realizing that organizations are not any longer kind of closed systems. So everything is interdependent, and if you think about your organization, if you're trying to get success in one area, the knock-on effect might be kind of failure in another area. And it's really to try and develop an idea of the organization as a network, really, and to work out how within that network, how communication can be improved, how you can create a very responsive organization, how you can release leadership spirit throughout the organization. So it's about communications, it's about interdependence, and it's about ethics, and it's about creating a leadership spirit, so that, like in transition towns, you get this very kind of dynamic culture where kind of leadership's popping up all over the places and in very unexpected places.
Okay, sounds good, Simon. Everyone, we will answer questions at the next stop. But Simon, by all means, please proceed with the third part of the presentation.
Okay, I'll go ahead with leadership formation. Leadership formation is a way of thinking about developing eco-leadership. And leadership formation changes the focus from leaders to leadership. It's a shift from the individual to the collective, from skills to context, from targets and instrumentalism to thinking spaces and holism. It's about generative leadership. So contemporary leadership development sits largely within the leader as therapist discourse. That is, HR departments identify high potential individuals, and the process of psychometrics and leadership development programs are used to increase leadership skills. Yet leadership is not simply a set of techniques to be learned. Leaders are formed through multiple experiences, and it's an organization's task to create unique leadership formation processes specific to its organizational needs, for local teams and for individual needs. So leadership formation really is about individuals, teams, organizations. It's really about thinking locally and specifically. I came across this idea. I was writing this book, Leadership: A Critical Text, and I was coming to the final chapters, and I was reviewing the discourses, and I was thinking about leadership development. And I went to stay in a monastery in California called the Kamal Delis Hermitage in Big Sur, a wonderful place. And whilst I was there, I observed the monks. And I thought, a monk is not trained in monk skills. A monk undergoes monastic and spiritual formation. And it struck me that as I was thinking about leadership, that this is similar to leaders. You don't really train a leader in leadership skills. I watched the monks, and they were formed by their context: the liturgy, the prayer cycle, silent reflection, a spiritual director, and the life of the community. And I believe that this mirrored the process of leadership. If you speak to leaders and you ask them what were the major influences on their life, they rarely say it was a course they went on or an MBA. They usually say it was something in their childhood, a mentor or a leadership figure, and then they talk about the mistakes they made in a certain job and what they learned on that job. And they really talk about a formation process. They talk about learning from experience, learning from being inward, learning from a context. And it struck me that monks have developed a formation process over 1,500 years successfully. And that in leadership, the formation process is very ad hoc. It's very much left to sort itself out with these high potential and individual leaders getting some training. But the holistic requirements of leadership are not catered for very well. So training individuals in leadership skills ignores the systemic question of how to create spaces that enable leadership to flourish. To create dynamic, adaptive cultures requires distributed leadership at all levels. This enables teams to work across complex boundaries and to engage multiple stakeholders. To develop the eco-leadership discourse, leadership formation is a process needed. So, leadership formation means to create an organizational architecture. So we have to kind of think about the organization as an ecosystem and as an architecture, and we have to place leadership at the center of this. Leadership formation is not something which happens outside an organization. Individuals or teams might be sent on courses as part of a formation process, but that's only one aspect of it. Leadership has to be at the core of any strategic organizational thinking. And this is not about creating high potentials, because taking the cream off the top of the milk just leaves a lot of followers. And what we're trying to develop is distributed leadership. So the Eco-Leadership Board, as was asked before, has to create organizational spaces. They have to redevelop their architecture. They have to create connections. They have to think about who should mentor who in the organization. They have to ask each sector, each team to think about its own formation. People have to think about their own needs, their own way of developing. My way of developing will be very different from anyone else's, and my team. So it's about specifics, and it's about local, and it's about really creating a process. And each organisation should have an overarching kind of idea called leadership formation, and it should have lists of mentors. It should have coaches. It should have places for each team to develop skills, to share knowledge, to share best practice. It's about linking these things up and creating a holistic kind of leadership practice in an organisation. Leadership formation means people learn through the rituals, the liturgies, and the daily performance of work. Leadership formation takes place within individuals, teams, and whole organizations. It's both a local and a global approach to leadership. Each person, team, organization develops a formation process tailored to their specific needs. The organization sets out overarching principles, values, and an architecture that enable learning and formation to take place. Teams and individuals then identify specific and particular needs depending on their work, context, their history, their place, and their purpose. We often people think about leaders, they think about heroes, they think about charisma. But taking the notion of charism from the monastery is helpful. Each monastic order has its special charism, and charism means its unique gift. So each monastic order has its charism, each monastery or hermitage has its charism, and each monk also has their charism. So each monk will go through the process of formation collectively with the other monks. So there's a collective process of formation, but there's also a unique individual process. Each individual monk will have their own needs. Likewise in the workforce. One of the problems with leadership today is the idea of universal competences in organizations. They try to align and create uniform leadership processes, but that doesn't really account for the quiet leader in the corner who, if given an opportunity, will probably be thinking something very, very creative but is never heard. So this leadership formation process recognises diversity, and it recognises the need for distributed leadership. We should think about employees and what charisms they have. We should think about teams, what charisms they have. We should think about different parts of the organisation, what developmental needs, what charisms they have. It's the opposite to setting out universal leadership competency frameworks. Mentoring and coaching will be really important in this process. Any developmental activity which is very specific and guides people through a process where they can learn from others, they can learn from their work, is really important. Leadership formation is both a formal and informal process. Informally, leaders act as elders and guides, pointing the way, being role models, and conveying the company culture and values in the way they take up their roles. For leadership formation to be successful, two conditions need to be met. Leadership formation must be holistic and embedded in organizational culture. It's not just an add-on. And leadership formation requires both an informal and a formal process. I'm going to stop there, Mike, and throw it open again.
All right, Simon, sounds good. We've got a long list of questions for you, so I'm going to jump right in.
Yeah, good.
Simon, where is the resistance to this shift to the eco-leadership coming from? Is there a resistance to eco-leadership?
Yeah, the resistance has come from mainly from our cultural focus on short-termism. Really, that's the key thing. Is the way the structures of our financial system, the structures of companies, is on short-term results. Whether it's shareholder or if in your public sector, the demands. There's a real problem with thinking sustainably, thinking about the future because of this kind of immediate short-termism. You don't survive unless you kind of deliver quarterly results. This is kind of one of the key resistances. So whilst people might acknowledge eco-leadership as being really, really important, they often kind of revert back to short-termism. And the other thing is that people are very conditioned over many, many years to be to focus on just rational and linear structures, and eco-leadership is kind of a very non-linear way of thinking. So as I say, it's an emergent discourse, and we're really wrestling to find a way of doing this. But I've been encouraged in the last, since 2000, that this was a very kind of, before that it was a very hidden discourse. Now it's really becoming on mainstream, and people are really discussing it because they know they have to find ways of doing this thing.
Gotcha. And Simon, the next question really follows up nicely with what you've been discussing. Eco-leadership exists, but controller leadership is creeping in with the worry in an unstable economy. So are there specific strategies that you know of that prevent that transition backwards?
Yeah, I do a lot of work with these, and I go into different organizations, and we get people to map out their preferences for these discourses, and we think about how they compete in organizations. One of the strategies is creating containers, emotional and containers of anxiety in organizations. So one of the key leadership jobs is to be a container of anxiety, because what happens often is when you get financial pressures, when you get a financial slump and the problems of a recession, people really resort back to being very controlling. It's like an instinctual thing. People just go back to being controlling. Tony Blair was classic in this in the UK. He was a very visionary leader, very gifted visionary leader. But his New Labour project always reverted back to controller strategy when they had to deliver results. So we found ourselves with visionary kind of leadership at one level. When we had to deliver in the public sector, in the National Health Service, it was all done through controller strategies. So it's really holding on to somehow people have container anxiety and work through that, because it's just that flip back which needs to be resisted.
Gotcha. Simon, one of our participants made the connection that eco-leadership is streamlined and kind of consistent in the discussions of servant leadership by chance, principles of governance, etc. How does eco-leadership cover more than other models that currently exist?
Servant leadership I would place in the discourse of the therapist, actually.
Okay.
Servant leadership, Greenleaf's work on servant leadership. I think that servant leadership is very useful, and eco-leadership really is an umbrella discourse which goes across these discourses. So if you're an eco-leader, you really, in any organization, you need some control. You know, I'm not a naive idealist who thinks that there's no control. You need control of your finances. You need some control of leadership. You need some safety. You need some regulation. So there's a part of for each of these discourses, and servant leadership is an important part of the therapist discourse, I think, where it's very much about human relations. It's very much about kind of how you relate to others. It's a very much a relational leadership. Whereas eco-leadership is much more about a systems way of thinking. It's much more about thinking across the whole system. So you'll have some Messiah leadership approach. You need some visionaries. You need some way of thinking, but you don't need the kind of those strong, dominating cultures. So you take parts of each of the discourse. You need your middle managers to be therapeutic in the therapeutic discourse, so that they can really work on that relational leadership. They can motivate teams. They can work with their kind of followers to bring them on and nurture them. So eco-leadership really crosses the boundaries of all these things, but it's much more about kind of systemic thinking than just relational thinking. I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah, no, that made complete sense. Simon, next question. Is there a direct link between the post-millennium generation of leadership and eco-leadership?
The post-millennium.
Yes.
Well, if the questioner means the 21st century and kind of what's coming, I think we've got a situation where we're in a real paradigm of change, both from a kind of technological perspective and a resource perspective. So we're as human beings, we find ourselves in a post-millennial kind of situation with our young people so much more adept at technology than we are, with the microchip just growing exponentially. I mean, I think that the internet's only been around 20 years, and it's so important to all our lives now, and these changes are going to be absolutely huge in the future. So we have to really think of ways of becoming eco-leaders, and I think that the new generation, the post-millennial generation, really is becoming aware of the demands of the environment, the need for something to be done about climate change, and the need to understand how we adapt to globalization and technology. So yeah, absolutely, it fits very much with post-millennial thinking.
And Simon, this question kind of comes in from the perspective of being part of the education MIG with ILA. When we talk about eco-leadership, as the author and the leading one of the leading scholars on this topic, how would you ask educators to teach this to their students? Is it for freshmen? Is it for seniors? Is it for graduate students?
It's for everybody, and it needs to be taught at kind of multiple levels. I mean, eco-leadership really is a way of thinking, and we really need to start with the youngest. I mean, it needs to be started in the kindergarten, really. Excuse me.
Simon, next question. What is what is your definition of ethics as used in eco-leadership?
Well, really, my definition of ethics is really to kind of think about the moral imperative, really. I mean, I hold at the centre of this question, what creates a good society? People would define good society differently, but the question is just held there all the time. What creates a good society? Is what I'm doing emancipatory, and does it help create human? Does it help human autonomy? Does it help free people, or does it kind of is it a coercive thing? So it's really about emancipation. It's really about kind of collectively creating a good society. It's about really thinking about power structures, being very honest about kind of where power lies, and trying to distribute power. It's just asking all those ethical questions and holding them centrally, really.
Simon, we've got a couple more questions for you, but at the same time, are there any more PowerPoint slides that you wanted to work through?
No, I think that's me done with PowerPoint. So I think I'm just having to take some questions and then round up, Mike.
Okay, sounds good. What can you say about links between these ideas, consciousness levels and your discourses? In other words, is it possible that the discourse corresponds to human consciousness development levels?
Do you know what the questioner means by consciousness levels?
You know what? I don't, but for the listener who wrote that question, if they could write back and clarify it a little bit more, we'll come back to that question. How does that sound?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, sounds good to me. Is eco-leadership still applicable in a crisis leadership situation, or is eco-leadership more appropriate to a steady state systems?
Okay, so eco-leadership should be trying to develop self-regulating systems, more steady-state systems. That's the idea of an eco-leader. You try and get a self-regulating system. In a crisis, two things need to happen. Sometimes people will, like I say, revert back to kind of command and control straight away, which can be important to kind of get some quick decision-making. Yet at the same time, an eco-leadership is still needed, because you still need to respond to the whole system. So often in a crisis, people kind of respond very quickly and automatically using command and control without thinking systemically, and they can create far more problems than they solve. So in this current crisis, for example, people can kind of react very quickly to the collapse of a bank, but they can end up creating far more problems unless they think systemically and what in the long term do we need to do to kind of get ourselves out of this mess.
Simon, next question. How can universal needs be catered for in such a localized leadership formation like the need to address climate change?
The idea of eco-leadership is that there's a local and a kind of universal imperative. So going back to this idea of transition towns, these are small local initiatives, but together they're happening all over the world, all over the place, and together they'll link up and they'll have a universal impact. And it's the same in organizations. You need to kind of create conditions where creativity and adaptive kind of behaviors can take place, where people can connect, where they can learn from each other, where they can develop ideas, where they can, and collectively this creates a kind of an adaptive organization which adapts to kind of the fast-moving society we live in, and can answer the call for sustainable and more widespread change. So it's not an either or, it's always a both and. It's really thinking locally and thinking globally.
Sounds good. Simon, back to the question on consciousness levels. We've got some more information for you. By consciousness levels, I mean to discuss the link between the discourses and human stages of development. For instance, Piaget, Wilber, and spiral dynamics. Eco-leadership is much more complex than the controller discourse, and so it might correlate to a higher human development or consciousness level. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not a great fan of working in these kind of stages. I know what the questioners means, and I've met Torbert and know Wilber's work. I don't think things kind of work quite so easy in these kind of stages, these kind of orange levels and these different stages. I think that's a bit functional for the way I think about these things. So for me, it's kind of, there's lots of paradoxes in this. So often young children kind of developmentally will be working at very they'll get this stuff much quicker at one level. You know, they'll understand things much quicker. Human development stages are very complex, I think. But the question is correct in the sense of saying it's also about sectors as well as about kind of what you do. So in some sectors you will, like manufacturing, you will get a different type of leadership. You will need more control leadership than kind of a complex organisation like the health service in the UK, for example, which is very complex, very people-orientated, and needs a much more kind of adaptive system than a kind of a car manufacturing industry. I don't know if that helps.
Simon, this next question comes from an educator, and there's kind of two theories on leadership: educators that teach leadership, and then educators that really want to develop leaders in their classrooms. So how do we begin to change the academic environment, which seems to be more of a controller environment, to a culture that nurtures leadership formation? I'm an advocate for being coaching, counseling, mentoring, spiritual direction skills into classroom facilitation, and I agree that this is vital for training our leaders. Yet we're so stuck on old models of teaching in many academic cultures. How do we start to make the cultural adjustment in the classroom?
Yeah, well, I worked very hard at this. I went on a master's degree at the Tavistock, and I was a director of coaching at Lancaster. And pedagogy is really important about this, really thinking about how people learn. I agree with the questioner wholeheartedly. It's a real problem, and we have to get innovators to start the process. I mean, I used to teach in a class in the Lancaster University. I used to start at 7:30 with yoga, then move into a free association matrix where people would sit in silence and associate their kind of emotional thoughts, gather those, think about what the group had learned, and then we'd move into kind of coaching pairs. So really thinking about the pedagogy, thinking about how you set up the classroom. Do you teach inside the classroom, outside the classroom? I recently took a group down to the Tate Modern Gallery in London and got them to really think about the projections they had on the artwork. So I think it's really about innovators, really thinking about new pedagogies to teach, because the question is absolutely right. We really have to shift this, and it's about innovation. It's about really taking risks and trying to kind of show methods which are successful, and people are attracted to them.
Fantastic. Simon, we've got about 5 more minutes here. Is there anything that you'd like to summarize in terms of 5 or 6 more minutes to our audience?
I just round up. Thank all the questioners. It's been really, really great that everyone's been asking such thoughtful questions. Just to go back, the idea of these discourses they're not fads. They're really trends which kind of and assumptions people kind of internalize within themselves. They don't go away. They're still with us. These 4 discourses, and this is just one way of describing leadership. I'm not claiming this is kind of like the only way. This is one way I did research, and one way I could describe some key themes which are going on. And just to summarize, this shift to leadership, I don't think it's a choice we have. I think it's something we're having to kind of do because of the environmental and social changes around us. It's a process of adaptation, really. No one's got there's not 5 golden bullets way to answer how we do this, but it really is about thinking differently, thinking about a new paradigm, thinking about how we lead without such a controlling way, thinking beyond just relationships, thinking about our relationship to the environment as well, thinking about our relationship to the micro and the macro. It's crossing these boundaries from the internal to the external, from the micro to the macro, thinking about individuals, teams, organizations, and then whole social issues. The way to develop eco-leaders is through, I think, this idea of leadership formation, which is really about holistic intervention and each organization, each team should be thinking about kind of where does it allow leadership to flourish, how does it encourage leadership to flourish in its organization, how does it connect different parts of the organization, how does it kind of connect up with the environment, with the society outside, and make some sense of it. So I think that's enough for me, Mike. I'm going to end up there.
Sounds good, Simon. I believe Josh Tarr is going to come in.
Okay.
Josh, are you there? Well, as the mediator of this presentation, it's been absolutely my pleasure, Simon, to have you working with us and explaining more about your academic discipline and eco-leadership. So a big thank you to you and your time. Would there be an opportunity to have a post-discussion on the IOA space?
I'll be here for a short while, yeah. I've got to dash off in about 20 minutes, but I'll be here for a short while to respond to any emails. And thank you very much, Mike, and thank you all for listening. I really appreciate your time.
Well, fantastic. The IOA Space, for all of our listeners, the IOA Space is our new online community for ILA members. Simon is hosting a post-webinar discussion here. Simply log on to www.ilaspace.org, and that way you can continue the conversation with Simon.
Great. Thanks to Simon and thanks Mike, and thank you to our audience for being just so engaged and so thoughtful with your questions. Please keep them coming on ILA Space. You can always connect with here at the ILA. Email is jtarr@ila-net.org, and you can always find us on the web, www.ila-net.org. thank you again, Simon. It was terrific. And to everyone, thank you for attending.
Thanks, Josh.